Welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Ryan Craven, and our guest today is Bruce Kettler. Bruce is the Director of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. He was appointed by Governor Holcomb in January of 2018 and is also the Director of Agribusiness Development for the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. Bruce was appointed to Governor Holcomb's cabinet in December of 2019. He joins the department with over 30 years of agricultural leadership experience and knowledge that spans from production, agricultural, and sales to community and industry relations. Bruce grew up in Western Ohio and developed a passion and appreciation for ag at an early age. After serving as the National FFA Vice President, he attended the Ohio State University and graduated with a bachelor's degree in agronomy with an emphasis in agricultural business. He began his professional career in 1987 at Dow AgroSciences, where he spent 17 years working in a variety of roles. In 2006, he joined Beck's Hybrids as a sales consultant and worked his way up to area team leader, field sales manager, and then director of public relations, a position he held prior to joining the ISDA. Bruce is a 2012 graduate of the Indiana Agricultural Leadership Program. His main priority includes agricultural advocacy, economic development, youth development, and environmental stewardship. Bruce, thanks for joining us today. Director Kettler, thanks again for joining us today. If you would, could you kind of get started with us on explaining a little bit of the ag economy in Indiana overall?
Be glad to. Indiana's agriculture economy is a really important source in Indiana for economic activity. Some would say it's depending upon the sectors you look at, but would say it's probably about the second largest sector overall, a lot of times behind manufacturing. But it's better than a $31 billion industry in the state of Indiana. So of course, with that kind of activity, not only do we have farms and farm activity, but it supports a lot of jobs in the areas of people that supply our farmers, or the processing of those products that they raise, or maybe even the transportation and hauling of those products. So it is a significant industry in Indiana. One of the things that's really neat, I think, about the ag economy in Indiana is it's actually a lot more diversified than most people would think. A lot of people, maybe the people that drive around Indiana much, realize that we really are more than corn and soybeans, but in some cases, people, if they haven't been here, they would say, well, you're just corn and soybeans. We might even get a reputation from years ago as being a significant pork producer. And while that's true for corn and soybeans and pork, really, I think there's been a significant effort to make sure that we do diversify our crops, so and livestock as well. So yes, corn, soybeans, wheat, kind of the normal commodities, but we're also very large in crops such as tomatoes, the melon crop, and the melons in Southwest Indiana were well known for melons and the quality of our melons that we have, and among a number of other crops that are there. And on the livestock side, it's very much that way as well. I mean, yes, we are strong in pork production, but when you look at poultry and then the different sectors within poultry, we're extremely strong. So we're number 2 in terms of egg production in the United States here in Indiana. We're a very, very large turkey producer as well. And then we are number 1 in the United States in duck production that's used for food. So it's very diversified along that line. So yes, while we raise a lot of corn and soybeans, what a lot of people have to remember is a lot of those crops go into the livestock sector to feed those protein sources in the livestock sector that we have. Just real quick, one other thing I would say is, one of the areas that we tend to think about agriculture in Indiana that a lot of states don't necessarily think about is we consider the hardwoods industry as part of our Indiana agriculture environment. Again, about a 10 or $11 billion industry in the state of Indiana. It's huge. And, not only do we have people that are producing hardwoods, which, by the way, are very high quality, our soils, our environment allow us to have extremely high quality in hardwoods. But when you start to look at the industry that harvests and processes those hardwoods into other items, It's significant. It's huge. In fact, again, while we're talking about rankings, Indiana's 1 or 2 in things like kitchen cabinets, furniture manufacturing. So where a lot of hardwoods are used into those industries, and it's a significant part of what we do. And we consider it agriculture. It's a very different agriculture from what most people think about. But as our hardwood friends and farmers like to tell me, they are absolutely the most patient farmers that we have, because to grow good hardwoods takes 30 plus years. So you've got to be extremely patient if you want to be able to grow a crop of hardwoods.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say how much of exporting, or kind of that international realm, is involved in those numbers?
Yeah, it's a lot, and that's why things like the USMCA agreement, the trade agreements with China, Japan, and other countries are so significant, not only to the United States but to Indiana as well. So we have about the 8th largest export market or opportunity for our ag products in Indiana, in all the states in the United States. So it's very significant for us. But again, those agreements that I talked about are really critical for farmers in Indiana. One good example is when we talk about the USMCA, or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which of course is a modernized version of what was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That was very significant for Indiana, because Canada and Mexico have a couple of key pieces that are really important to Indiana agriculture and to our farmers. First and foremost, those 2 countries are generally our number 1 and number 3 trading partners out of Indiana in terms of exports and what we have. So very significant. But of course, to me, what's even more important than that is just the fact that being able to trade with your neighbors says a lot about what you can do with other countries all around the world. And, that's why, for me, it was really critical that we get a good, modernized, current version of USMCA passed that helped not only agriculture, but of course for Indiana, the manufacturing sector. It was critical that be an important part of that. But we really rely upon Canada and Mexico for a lot of the products that we produce in Indiana to get those out there. And the other part of that's interesting, and I would say there were a couple parts of that agreement that were improved that really should help Indiana agriculture specifically. One is dairy. So Canada had a class system in terms of trading dairy products that was not good for the United States. It was very discriminatory to our United States dairy farmers, and of course that affected Indiana as well. The other part of that is on the livestock side. Mexico is a huge user of pork products, or poultry products, and what's real interesting about that, in a lot of cases, and particularly for those 2 commodity groups, they use a lot of the items that we would consider almost waste in the United States, but because of their culture and their people, they like those things. So think of things like chicken paws and some of the other materials that we don't typically eat or use for products in the United States, but it gives our farmers and our processors an opportunity to be able to sell those products, and instead of having waste that would go to a landfill or however we might dispose of it, or renderer, we're able to get some value and some money for those products by shipping it to those folks. So that's, again, another reason for us to have a very diversified economy in our agriculture that's helpful, is it helps to be able to spread out some of the highs and lows we might experience.
Yeah, thank you for that information. To kind of follow up on the USMCA, is there anything that stands out specifically from that agreement that you would like to highlight that really showcases the benefits and kind of the need for change?
Yeah, yes, I think there are a couple. I pointed out things like dairy, eggs, and poultry, the milk class restriction. One of the other parts of that agreement that I thought was really important, not only for just the three countries involved in this agreement, but it set a stage for other potential agreements with other countries, particularly maybe the United Kingdom and the European Union. And that has to do with what was called ag innovations and being able, so think of biotechnology, for example. There was specific language put into that agreement that acknowledged that we need to think about innovations in agriculture, such as biotechnology, and the importance of those innovations for our farmers and for people to be able to be fed around the world. And that was one example. That was not in the former NAFTA agreement. There was nothing in there. Well, you think about it, it wasn't high on the radar 30 plus years ago when that agreement was there. Biotechnology was a very new thing, or kind of a pie in the sky kind of thing. Well, it's very different now. Plus, we've got things like gene editing that are the newer versions of technology that could be used in crops and livestock. And so modernizing that agreement on ag innovations and things like the use of biotechnology and defining the importance and the significance of it and how we test and how we regulate it across the borders of the countries is really important.
Well, and when you talk about those technologies, they've come such a long way, but I feel like there's still some of that misconception of how, the negative and the nightmare scenarios and all that kind of stuff. But I think you made a very good point of this helps codify and explain and kind of showcase, well, these are the regulations and the standards that go into these products, especially given that there's an opportunity for those potentially to go overseas.
That's exactly right. And we are all for, I know, as a department and in our industry, we're all for various ways of being able to produce our food. If somebody likes organic and they like that process, or that's what they want to consume or want to eat, great, we're all for that. We think that's good. What I really think is important on this ag innovation piece within the USMCA agreement is that basically it recognizes that we're using a science-based approach when we talk about implementing these. We're not just willy-nilly saying, okay, this looks like something really neat that we think would be good to use without going through the process of looking how the science works. And that's what that agreement really laid out, was it's got to be a science-based approach. It doesn't mean that we don't regulate them, because good regulation of products, whether it's in the United States or across borders, is okay and perfectly acceptable. But we want to make sure that it is a science-based approach when we do that.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. What, given the current situation abroad, COVID pandemic is a worldwide issue, and different countries and areas and regions are impacted in different ways and at different speeds. How is that impacting Indiana, on the ag side?
Well, it's impacted us in a lot of ways, and I think it's going to take us a while to figure out all those impacts and what they look like. I would say, in the short term, when all of this hit, probably the biggest shock that you and me and anybody that eats food and is a consumer goes to the grocery store was what it did to the food supply in our grocery stores. And so what we found is, for the most part, I think that our industry, in terms of supplying food, whether it's from the farmer to the processor, was fairly resilient. Now, a lot of people would probably say, yeah, except we saw empty grocery shelves. So, I couldn't get meat and poultry and pork and whatever it was for a long time. That's true. So I'm not saying it's perfect. It's a system that certainly I think we have identified because of COVID. We've got some things to work on, and we've got to figure out how to make it better. But here's the part that I don't think a lot of us don't really realize when it comes to food and processing and how it works. there really are two primary areas when we think about food and what happens. We think of the food that we get into our grocery stores. Let's think of that like retail. That's really kind of a retail type of model, okay? The other food is what I would call food service. So if you think about what's consumed in hotels, large institutions, whether that's colleges or schools, whatever that might be, what we would consider institutional or food service items, those are very different. They're somewhat different in terms of their distribution. They're certainly different in terms of how they're processed and how they're packaged. So, for example, you could have let's just take, for example, maybe a pork processor. They probably are utilizing when they're harvesting. They probably have different lines for those two different sectors. So the line that's packaging for retail tends to be packaging smaller type of items. The packaging looks different. You know, we're talking about a pound of bacon versus 5 or 10 or 20 pounds of bacon that might go to, say, a restaurant or a hotel. So they're packaged on very different lines, and you don't just flip a switch and say, okay, I'm going to convert all this line over to a retail package and vice versa. What happened with COVID was when especially when the lockdown started to happen, you know, the hotels, the restaurants, all of that stopped almost immediately. So it put a very, very quick stop onto what was going on. So the distributors that normally distribute into those channels, they had a lot of food in those package types and everything that you know, what are they going to do with it? So there's something that I think we've got to learn is, can we be more flexible with that? You know, then the other part was, fortunately for agriculture, when this all came down, agriculture was considered an industry that was essential. And so, and from a timing standpoint, if we think about this happened in, say, March to April, here in Indiana, of course, that's when we are looking and starting to plant our crops or a lot of our major crops anyway, or get started on it. And so, fortunately, we didn't have to, you know, those folks were considered essential workers, including the processors, the suppliers at the co-ops, and the retailers that supply our farmers. So we were able to keep that moving. Now, it did affect it because, you know, we had to worry about things like, are we going to be able to get gasoline and diesel fuel and all the input supplies that our farmers needed, and how was that going to happen? Because there was an intense competition for things like trucks, if you will, because again, we knew we had to move a lot of products, relief supplies, food, fuel, whatever that might be. That got I won't say it got disrupted, but it certainly was going to change. And so our people in agriculture had to compete for that time and that space in trucks and truck drivers and people as well.
Well, you don't know, you know, you think you have the best process for your system until something like this comes along and
Right.
shows those holes in the system.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, you know, we'll be the first to admit it's not a perfect system, but we're already working as an industry to figure out, okay, how are we going to make this happen? One of the areas that we're working on is this processing of, you know, pork, poultry, beef, whatever it might be. You know, a lot of the local processing plants that some people maybe use and utilize, they're very backed up. For most part, those processing plants have at least a year wait. So there's a lot of people waiting on that. There's one positive thing I will say came out of that, and that was more people really started to think about where their food comes from and how does it get from the farm to either my plate at home or the grocery store or wherever. So there's a positive thing there. People started to pay more attention to that. And it also, so in the State Department of Agriculture, we've got a program called the Indiana Grown Program, where we promote and products that can be produced, processed here in the state of Indiana. A lot of it is food products, not all of it, but a lot of it's food products. So we had a lot of people very interested in figuring out, how can I go buy local products and where can I get those local products that might be close to me? So there has been some positives in terms of people understanding where the food comes from.
Yeah, again, so fantastic information. I think one of the last questions I want to ask you is one of the curiosity is, you have a strong history in, the ag business and, the ag world. What's one fact that just might surprise, folks about that industry, and folks that it would surprise them if thinking about it as a career?
Oh, golly, that's a very tough question. I'll answer that in two parts. So the first is, there are a lot of people that I think have very strong preconceived notions about agriculture, and maybe especially farming, the production side of agriculture, that I would challenge them to dig into and figure out how it's probably nothing like what they think about. In many respects. Now, in some ways, it very much is. It's still very traditional in a lot of aspects, but in many ways, it's much more technologically advanced than a lot of people realize. Talking about broadband and connectivity, it's the reason that we're trying to work very, very hard, and I know in the state of Indiana is trying to work very hard to figure out how we're going to get that broadband and connectivity to all areas, rural areas of the state. Because if you think about it, most of our businesses in, let's say, our urban areas or suburban areas, they're tied technologically. I mean, we're using email, they're using point of sale systems that are connected, whatever it might be. The same is true on the farm, and for the retailers that supply those farmers, whether it's with crop inputs, their feed for their livestock, whatever it is. They're businesses too that need to be able to provide and have that electronic connection to be able to make this work. Farmers are certainly no different. So one of the challenges, I think, is for people to maybe investigate from the production agriculture and the agribusiness side how technologically advanced this really is. The other part of that then that kind of goes with that is I will talk to anyone, no matter their age, about their interest in careers and in a potential job that they would like to have. And if they tell me, I don't think there's something that I can do with my interest, my passion, that would fit in agriculture. And I bet I can talk to anybody and help them understand there is a place in this industry for them, no matter what they do and where they are. Again, technology, we need all those people. If we think about our cars, I've heard it said recently, a car is really just in many respects an electronic device or a computer on wheels anymore. And if you think about it, it's very true. Well, the same is true of our very modern farming equipment. And if we think about it, okay, it takes somebody to figure out how to program that information so that it works in that piece of farm equipment. If that equipment breaks down, and as we all know with technology, it breaks down or something happens to it, just like happened to us, somebody's got to be able to figure out how to diagnose what went wrong and to make it happen and to fix it. Sometimes that might take a computer programmer, for example, to make that work. So what I would say is to anybody that may not be thinking about agriculture as a career, I hope you'll stop and think and look. Go to our university systems. Think about our local ag education programs and FFA programs in high schools and look at it. Even our community college system in the state of Indiana has several agriculture programs that are there. So I just encourage people, dig into it. And if you can't quite find something when you dig into it, give our department a call. We'll be more than glad to help you find a way that we can connect you into this industry, because it's a great industry. It's full of great people and people that are very passionate about raising crops and feeding others. And they really like what they're doing. But we also need the minds from various sources to be able to help us figure that out.
Yeah. Would you say, somebody that has a language skill or a multicultural background, is there like opportunities for those folks as well, and kind of what would those look like?
Absolutely. In many cases, not only maybe here in the United States, but maybe even around the world. You know, we were talking about trade. We need people that understand agriculture that could help us with those trade agreements. You take things like the extension service in our land grant system. There are constantly people going to other countries, particularly maybe undeveloped or third world countries, and helping those folks understand how they might be able to raise crops or raise livestock to feed themselves. So absolutely, it doesn't matter the culture, the background, the experience you've got, there's a place for you in this industry. And we really do need all kinds of people and their thinking and where they come from and their perspectives in our industry.
Perfect. Well, Director Kettler, thanks again for all that wonderful information, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Will do. Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Take care. That's it for this edition of Cyber Focus. For suggestions on future topics or questions, please drop us a note at cyber@indiana.edu.